Okay, so let me go ahead and present to you. We move away from looking at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century for a bunch of different countries, and we start now to look at ideas, new kinds of isms, new ideas that are going to affect late 19th century and 20th century history. And one of them, of course, is Marxist socialism. I hope you're okay with the red. You can see that. You can hear me. Once again, I ask you, I implore you to ask questions and tell me to stop if you have any. So Marxist socialism is based on the ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels as a kind of partnership. Try to say Engelsism, and you understand why it's Marxism. Or let's be honest, it's really for the most part Marx's ideas and Engels' money that create Marxist socialism. They're both products of the 19th century, as you can see, living their lives within that century. Karl Marx is of bourgeois background, which is really kind of obnoxious, but is kind of a truism that most all leaders who are quote unquote communist or Marxist or whatever you want to call them, most all of them actually are of bourgeois background rather than working class background. I think that makes sense though, because you have to have a little bit of education in order to come up with the kinds of ideas they're coming up with. He's also a Prussian, but when I think of Prussians, I don't think of Karl Marx. I think of guys wearing spiky helmets. So he is a Rhineland Prussian. The Rhineland is this area which is next to Belgium and is chock full of coal and iron ore. And it is a place like the Ruhr Valley is a place where you have a lot of industry. And so it makes sense that this guy who writes about the working class, who writes about industrialization, comes from this part of the German states, or eventually Germany, that is industrialized. He flees to Britain pretty early on, really even before the around the time of the 1848 revolutions, I think, because Britain is a freer climate where he can write what he wants to write and not be arrested in some of those German states. Friedrich Engels is probably one of the world's biggest disappointments to his father. He is the son of a factory owner, factory manager, and he is sent to Britain in order to learn how to be a good factory owner and factory manager. And since Britain is the kind of the model of an industrialized country, or the beginnings of an industrialized country, it makes sense that he would be sent to the model of the industrial city, which is Manchester. Instead of exploiting the proletariat and reveling in all the money that's being made in the factory, he starts to sympathize with the working class, with the proletariat. And in 1844, or published in 45, he writes The Condition of the Working Class in England, in which he accuses the bourgeoisie of being a horrible class of people, kind of a nasty exploiter class that is bent on continuing the misery of the working class and just making the money that they can off of the backs of the people. Pause for a moment if you want to comment on their beards or anything else. Okay, moving along then. Marx and Engels are both disappointed by the revolutions of 1848. I'd like to remind you that there's really only, I think, really only one country where the working class is really actively involved in the revolutions of 1848, in the sense of trying to create a state or a government for the working people. I'm going to go ahead and throw this out there. I hope all of you know this. What's the one place that has a revolution of 1848 where the working class really plays a role in trying to make their own 1848 revolution?
France?
Thank you very much. It's clearly France. And we had those bloody June days, if you remember that. Seems to be a thing in France, but nowhere else really. We have some national revolts and some liberal revolts, but really there isn't really a social revolt per se anywhere else. Marxism, as it says there, plays really no role in 1848. His ideas play no role in 1848, even though in January of 1848, he and Engels together write this thing called the Communist Manifesto. Marxism does become really quite important from the 1870s on, when most all of the countries of Europe have become industrialized, when they all have a proletariat, and when many of them are moving towards constitutional monarchies, or allowing some suffrage or some bits and pieces of democracy and the vote for men. When men get to vote, they vote oftentimes on their economic interests, and so the working class, just like in Britain, the working class creates a labor party, and they vote, for labor party candidates. In other parts on the continent, the working class gravitates towards Marxism because it promises them a quick revolution and a much brighter future. It is, though, very scary for anybody who's not proletarian to hear Marx's ideas and to hear that a revolution is coming. Here's some of the origins of Marxism. Once again, feel free to stop me. I'm on a roll. But there are a bunch of people who we didn't cover called the French utopian socialists. They're called utopian because their ideas are, according to Marx, dreamer ideas, fantasy ideas, not realistic ideas, like his ideas, which he claims are scientific. But they're ideas about basically how the class with all the money, the bourgeoisie, needs to in some way share what they've got, and there's a bunch of different ideas about how to share. For example, Louis Blanc's idea about the state buying factories for the working class, or there is a woman named Flora Tristan who says that all of the working class needs to be put together in one giant union in order to take care of themselves and fight for better wages and representation and so on. Or there's a guy by the name of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon who says that wealth is or that capital is theft. Wealth is theft. It's stolen from the class who actually does the work. So anyway, there's a bunch of French utopian socialists who have all of these ideas that Marx steals from, while at the same time criticizing them as utopian. And then, if you remember, there's David Ricardo's iron law of wages. Just pay the working class just enough to survive. Don't pay them any more than that. It's not really true. Over time, wages do improve. There's also the French Revolution. The Marx studies the French Revolution. He learns some lessons from the French Revolution. He thinks same way he's studying the Industrial Revolution and learning some things from that. And then he throws on top of it a German philosopher by the name of Hegel, and Hegel's idea is this thing called the dialectic. Anyway, take all of these things together, throw them together in a pot, heat it up, stir for 2 hours, and you get Marxism. And I'll tell you about that in just a second. Marxism is based on economic determinism, that economic relationships are more important, are more influential than every other kind of relationship in terms of moving society forward or moving history forward. So economic relationships between classes create, in fact, everything else. It creates system of governments. It creates how families are made up. It creates systems of law. It creates spiritual beliefs. It creates philosophical beliefs. At the root of everything is how people are working, what people own, and that kind of stuff. Economics determines everything else. And I'll give you some examples of that in a second, just to sort of make that clear of how that works. Pausing for a moment. We're good. You just need some examples. So I don't think you need to write all of this down because it's a lot of stuff, but just kind of sit back and listen to me and see if you can agree that the way that the economy is determines everything else or creates everything else. So if you go back to medieval times, you have 96% of the people just as serfs or peasants. They're working in the fields, and then they have over them, protecting them, governing them, lords, and the aristocrats. And this economic relationship between all of these producers and just a few overlords, and the economic producers producing everything for themselves and then everything for the overlords. That leads to, according to Marx, everything else. So this is why you only need one Christian church. There's that economic relationship in some way, shape, or form creates just the need for one Catholic Church. Feudalism, the protection and the governance and all that kind of stuff. Even the idea or the philosophy of chivalry. For Marx, all of that stuff is created just by the way that the economy is running. In industrial times too, industrial production, where you have capitalists and proletarians. Because of this relationship, because of the way that money is being made, because of the way that people are working, it inevitably leads to it determines the system of government, like constitutional monarchies and the isms that we studied, like nationalism and liberalism and so on. It leads to declining religious belief. It leads to Victorian morality, which is a kind of additional moral code in addition to the religious codes of the times and all these other sorts of things. According to Marx, this is what is creating everything else. I want to remind you, by the way, these ideas that we talk about are just that. They're just ideas. They're not really true. They're just somebody's way of explaining the world or explaining, why we have what we have in terms of history or society. Good questions? Okay. In Marxist terms, everything is all about class conflict. That in modern times, in the 19th century, there are just two different classes left over. I'm going to wink at you and kind of nudge at you too, because this is nonsense. As you know, there's not just an exploiter class and an exploited class. Did I miss something? No. Okay. So throughout history, there's always been class conflict, according to Marx. And so if you go back to the medieval period, you had lords and serfs. And this class conflict between lords and serfs creates a new class called the bourgeoisie, a town-dwelling class called the bourgeoisie. That's what he says. We do see that. I mean, I kind of did that at the beginning of the year. I kind of said, oh, there's lords and there's serfs, and suddenly threw towns at you and towns and trade. And so that kind of thing is sort of happening, whether it's created by a clash of economic reasons. I don't really know. That's what Marx is saying. Or if you go to the French Revolution period, you have the clash of the aristocracy versus the bourgeoisie, clashing together, which allegedly creates a kind of new class, the proletariat class. Well, I don't know, if you view the aristocrats as land-based wealth, and if you view the town-dwelling bourgeoisie as like the beginnings of manufactured wealth, then the bourgeoisie are going to start to hire people to be proletarians. I don't know. That's what he's saying. Class conflict is creating new classes, and then a new kind of class. And so, in the period of time that Marx is talking about, and going forward, he says that there's only two classes left. There's the capitalist or the capital owning bourgeoisie versus the nothing owning proletarians. And that clash, this is the end clash, the end of history, is going to result in no more classes at all, no more social classes once the Great Revolution happens. Pausing for a moment once again. Okay. My mic is on, right?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay. There's this thing called the Hegelian dialectic. I'd just like you to know about it just because it makes me happy. It's like knowing how to pronounce Goethe. Um, that is Hegel. And his idea is that it's a philosophical idea that there are situations. There is a thesis. This thesis is any given situation. The existence of any thesis or the existence of any given situation creates its opposite, the antithesis, whatever it happens to be. And so thesis in its existence creates its opposite, the antithesis. Those two things clash together, which creates a kind of synthesis, a new thing. That synthesis creates a new thesis, and then we can kind of move on from that. Once again, it's just Hegel's idea. It doesn't actually exist unless you want it to exist in your mind. History evolves through a clash of opposites. For Marx, he's talking about the clash of the exploiters versus the exploited, going throughout all of history. Go back to the ancient Egyptians, and you have all of these people who are, slaves or just workers, and then you have this elite class of priests and the pharaoh and so on, and that clash creates, some sort of new classes and more complicated classes. Anyway, a new kind of situation. The Hegelian dialectic. You heard it here first, perhaps. Thesis creates antithesis. They clash together to create a synthesis. That's what I was talking about when I was looking at these classes conflicting together and then creating a new situation or a new class. So once again, you don't necessarily have to write this down, but just sit back and consider it. Once upon a time, there were just nobles and serfs with feudalism. And that clash of nobles versus serfs creates the rise of towns and trade, and it creates the formation of the bourgeoisie. So if your thesis is the noble class versus the antithesis, the opposite of the nobles, the serfs. Anyway, you're creating the bourgeoisie. And then over a period of time, you've got the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy struggling for supremacy, clashing together once again. And in the English Revolution of 1688, the Glorious Revolution, and the French Revolution of 1789, think about that. In some respects, we have aristocrats in charge, and then a clash of the aristocrats with the non-aristocrats, and then this is an actual question. Who wins those clashes? At the end of the revolutions, English and French Revolution, are the aristocracy supreme? Or do you have more people who aren't aristocrat having a stake in power?
The second thing.
Thank you very much. The latter, Mr. Barron, of course. Good. So I think that it sort of works in a very broad historical way. Once again, not really sure that you need to write all of this, but think about how the French Revolution in particular, this is the thing that really moves Marx, is the triumph of the bourgeoisie. When all men are created equal, it doesn't really mean that all men are equal. It just means that there's now a meritocracy, and that the bourgeoisie, the property-owning non-noble class, really gets to have the same rights before the law and eventually the same political rights as the old aristocrats. And always, 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 1789, okay, for a short period of time, the lower classes have their day, but 1830, 1848, the lower classes continually get left out of power. They get, it's like the bourgeoisie says, oh, you're free now. You're free to be poor. Have a nice day. And we're all free now. So the government's going to protect our property at the expense of the lower classes who want to kind of Robin Hood things, take from the richer and give to the poor. So the French Revolution leads to a new class of exploiters, the bourgeoisie, and then the Industrial Revolution is creating a class of people called the proletariat. And that's where Marx is getting his ideas about this last clash of two different classes. I'll pause if you have any questions or comments. Okay. Well, here's a whole bunch of stuff, but this might be worth jotting down. I know there's a lot, but according to Marx, you really have to say that because it's just nonsense. Well, I'll just wait for a second, then I'll remind myself, hopefully, to say why this is nonsense. According to Marx, in the 19th century, there are now just two classes left: the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And the bourgeoisie as capitalists are interested in always making more money and competing. You know how capitalism is really competitive, competing with other capitalists to lead to make more money. And now, what Marx thinks is that this capitalist competition between the bourgeoisie is driving some bourgeois people out of the bourgeoisie and forcing them into the proletarian class. So the bourgeois class is going to become smaller and smaller and smaller due to capitalist competition. And the proletarian class is going to become larger and larger and larger. Boy, maybe we'll go through this all in just a second. The proletarians then are just miserable because, according to Marx, and because of the iron law of wages. This is Ricardo's idea that the proletariat will only always get paid just barely enough to survive. They're going to be really quite angry and so on. And then the proletarians start to realize that even though they're just simple working people, they'll realize that they are a class that needs to be together, that needs to join together in order to overthrow the shackles of the bourgeoisie. They will realize that they're being duped, that they're being tricked, that they're being hoodwinked, and that they're being exploited. And anything that the bourgeoisie might say about freedom is just nonsense. Okay, I'm gonna pause for a second. I'm gonna go back for a second. Why is that first idea kind of nonsensical? What's the still in the 19th century? What's the largest group of people socially?
Peasants.
Yeah, peasants or farmers or whatever you want to call them. So, hey, Marx, we're the peasants. And then, do people who are bourgeois, do they get driven out of the bourgeois class and into the proletariat? I don't think so. I just don't think it happens. I think if a business goes out of business, because it's driven out of business, that bourgeois person who owned the business that failed will just find a new business and a new niche to get into. Proletarians are getting over time higher and higher and higher wages. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. And then, well, I think it's really kind of hard for proletarians just to suddenly develop class consciousness. How is that supposed to happen when for a long time they can't read and write, and then eventually they will be able to? But things are getting better. Think of reform Marxism. It's hard to feel like you're being duped and exploited when you can afford to buy a sofa or a couch for your hovel or the place that you're living. So here are the ways that Marx says that the working class is being duped. Freedom is just bourgeois freedom. It doesn't really exist for the proletariat. You can enjoy freedom if you have property. If you have nothing, then freedom means nothing. For example, freedom of speech. If you're hungry, standing up on a soapbox and telling people you're hungry doesn't really help you very much. Or you can write whatever you want to write in a free society, but if you have no wealth, then it just doesn't matter. He thinks religion is the opiate of the masses. We'll be talking about opium towards the end of this unit. Do you know how opium makes you feel? If you do, I have to report you to the counselors, but does anybody? I'm not really going to report you. Is opium an upper or a downer in terms of drugs?
Upper.
It's actually a downer. So stay away from all drugs. That'll be my thing. But opium makes you lethargic. It makes you sleepy. It makes you not want to do anything. And so religion, telling the working class, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill. Well, maybe the stealing bit is actually just getting what's rightfully theirs. All capital is theft, all wealth is theft, and returning it to the people it belongs to. So, the opiate of the masses just means you don't want to do that, or you're encouraged not to do that. Property is theft. So, owning things, having capital, and that kind of stuff is just off the backs of the working class. Morality is created, Victorian morality or Christian morality is a kind of hypocrisy that's designed to keep the masses passive. Once again, killing is bad, murder is bad. Well, is it? When people are exploiting you, maybe they need to be murdered. according to Marx. The nation itself, nationalism, is really just a false division of the proletariat, which is created by economic interests, according to Marx and Engels, and it's a false division of the proletariat. The working man sees no country. The working man has no country. The working man should feel, their heart beat for other proletarians rather than be divided up into, German workers and French workers and British workers. And the government doesn't exist, in fact, to protect your rights to life, liberty, and property. It exists to protect the bourgeoisie's lives and liberty and property. And it is a kind of exploiter of or an oppressor of the exploited class. Pausing for a moment if you have any comments or questions. Okay. So this is what's going to happen. Marx is absolutely certain that this is going to be what happens. This is not a utopian idea. This is scientifically derived from those sources that I told you about, the Hegelian dialectic, his view of history, and so on and so on and so forth. Number one, CC, I was thinking cross country. It's not cross country. It is the class conscious proletariat. They realize what the deal is. They realize that they are a class together and they need to come together as a class and fight the exploiter class. So the class conscious proletariat will, at some point in time, overthrow the bourgeoisie. It's going to be like a 90% proletarian society and 10% bourgeois society. And the 90% will overthrow the 10%. They will establish then a dictatorship of the proletariat. The proletariat needs to create a dictatorship. They can't have freedom and so on, because the bourgeoisie, that exploiter class, is not going to willingly give up the power and the capital or the wealth that they have. So they have to create a dictatorship for a short period of time. They're going to abolish private property. They're going to equalize ownership of everything, or just, have everyone share everything. Just abolish private property. Everybody's going to work just because they want to, and everyone is going to share everything equally, and everybody will have enough, according to Marx and Engels. At this point in time, then, everybody is free. There's no reason why people should be exploiting each other. Everybody is producing what they want to produce as much as possible and getting as much as they want in return. And then the state, which had existed just to keep the exploiter class, in power, the state will just wither away. It'll just disappear, and everybody will live happily ever after. You've got to have some questions or comments about this.
What if you live in the fringes of society?
What if you live in a what?
What if you live in like the rural society and access to the like public property is hard to come by?
So
but everybody is urban.
Yeah, everybody is just sort of wherever they live, whatever they're doing, everyone is just producing because they want to and giving freely of what they have. And then everybody else is just taking freely of what everybody else is producing. It's almost like everybody's a busy little bee and everybody's got a big smile on their face, just producing the heck out of, whatever in order to give to other people.
What if I don't want to work?
But you will. The reason why you think you won't want to work is because of the way that the economy is now. In pre-revolutionary times. Once the revolution happens, everybody will no longer feel burdened or exploited or anything at all, and everybody will just, I think, produce the big old smile on their face.
What if I want to sleep, though?
Well, you can sleep, but I think once you're done sleeping, you're going to get up and be like, today I'm going to make widgets for everybody. And you're going to make widgets, and then you're going to get, dingly bobs from somebody else. According to Marx and Engels, I know you're thinking, but there's lazy people who aren't going to want to do anything. They think that everyone's just going to be really happy to do stuff. Anybody else?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Marx says that there's a proletariat and the bourgeoisie.
Yeah.
Would he consider like the top 1%, like Jeff Bezos, a bourgeois person, even though he is way above the majority of the bourgeoisie?
Yeah, in Marx and Engels' time, they don't have anybody who's quite that rich. I think there's like 10 people who own I don't know 40% of the world's wealth or some crazy thing like that. I just threw that out there. I'm just making that up, but it's somewhat true. Um, we don't have that quite yet. The richest of the rich aren't quite like that. Clearly, there is a class of people who own most everything even back then, though. And for Marx, in a very philosophical way or just a thinking way, those are the exploiter bourgeoisie, and anybody who doesn't really own very much is just the exploited proletariat. But,
I have a
So-
question.
yeah, go ahead.
You can continue if you want, Daniel.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, it was nothing. Never mind. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, so you said that they would think that everyone would just want to work and there'd
Yeah.
be no free riding or
Yeah,
anything like that.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
The reason I think they think that freeloaders and difficulties between people exist because of the exploiter exploited thing that's going on pre-revolution. I think that's how they would explain it. And once everybody feels free and realizes what that everybody's equal, truly equal, then everybody's going to live happily ever after. Talk about utopian. But he's a thinker, he's a philosopher and a historian, and he's not a politician. He's not actually trying to do this. Wait until people like Lenin try to actually implement this, and then you'll see that number 5 or 4 never go away, and 6, 4, 5, and 6 never happen. Hopefully that makes sense to you, right? And we'll talk about that when the 20th century rolls around. And I think that's what that parent was so upset about when they were looking at a young Marxist club. They thought about all of the horrible things that Marxist ideas had brought to the world, and the millions of people who suffered or died because of Marxism. I think that's why they were so upset about a young Marxist club. Marx says that all of this stuff is inevitable. It's going to happen. It's proven by his scientific view of history. And this is part of the problem, I think. Part of the problem is he's just a philosopher, not a doer, not somebody who's actually, trying to put this into effect and then find out that his ideas don't work or that they're wrong. But he believes, and then Marxists believe too, that this is just going to happen. And this is why, for the most part, these Marxists in these political parties and so on, late 19th century, early 20th century, they talk revolution, but they never actually try revolution until after World War I or during World War I and after World War I. And so the words that they use, the ideas, scare the heck out of everybody. They're talking about doing away with religion and the state and the family and marriage and all these kinds of things as a part of this communist or Marxist revolution. That sounds horribly scary to people then. And quite frankly, if I say that to you now, you're like, what? That's ridiculous. That's crazy. That just, we'll fight against that. So you can understand how scary these ideas are. But in reality, until the cataclysm of World War I, there isn't anyone who actually tries to do this in a state or to a state. And then it happens in the most obnoxious and backward of the states. And well, we get the importance then of Marxism to the 20th century. Marxism in the 20th century and its polar opposite, its antithesis. Yay, I get to use that. If Marxism is a thesis, really it's the other way around. Nationalism is our thesis. Marxism is the antithesis or the opposite of nationalism in many respects. These two are I think, influential isms of the late 19th and early 20th century. And there's going to be a clash between Marxism and nationalism. In particular, in Eastern Europe during World War II, there is a clash of a hyper-nationalist state versus a supposedly Marxist state, and millions of people die. I'm done. What you got for me?
So
Do you think Marxism could ever work?
No. It's certainly not in the way that he envisioned it. I do think this, though. Oh no, I'm being taped. I do think that that we're not quite done with the idea of, oh my gosh, there's some people who are like who own 40% of the world's wealth. How is that possibly possible when 60% of the people own almost nothing? I don't think we've seen the end of the questioning of that, and perhaps a redistribution in decades in the future of that in some way, shape, or form. It just doesn't make sense that there are some people who own more than in their own personal portfolios than entire countries are worth. And so there has to be at some point in time some sort of philosophical or political reckoning for that, I think. Other questions?
I have a comment.
Go ahead, Charlie. I love comments.
My sister took a whole college class on Marxism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did she say anything?
She really liked it, apparently.
I mean, any day that we do an AP Euro, you can turn into a semester-long college course. France, 1870 to 1914. That's somebody's college course. And so hopefully when you get to college, you're able to, whatever you study, you're able also to maybe take an upper level history course in something that you particularly enjoy. I took a course in the Reformation and loved that. Or I took an entire course called Martin Luther in German class. It was there were only 5 of us or 4 of us in the class. It was really hard to not have something to contribute every day. So yeah, it's cool. I hope you guys have the opportunity to find something that you really like and maybe pursue it in a class in college. Anything else? Other comments or questions? Cool. Once again, for tomorrow, I just have an article for you to read, and I'm going to kind of leave you alone just with an article. I'm not going to do any video or anything for you either. Just read the article, and then I think you have maybe like 10 questions that go along with the article in Kia. Thursday, Friday, I will be live. I will be continuing. I will put those in in YouTube for you, and so you can watch them whenever you want. It's more isms, it's more idea kind of stuff, late 19th century, early 20th century ideas, and we'll just keep rolling along. And the next Tuesday, I'm going to see some of you, and that's really kind of exciting to me too. I like the idea of knowing whether you are scowling at me or smiling at me as I tell you things about European history. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good
Bye.
day.
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Barron,
Yeah.
would you like to see my dog?
Yeah, I would love to see your dog.
Hey, sweet.
Oh. Oh.
There you go.
Rupert. Hey, Rupert, come here. I'll see if I can get Rupert to come here. Or I'll show you Rupert. Come here. Come here. There's the big poodle. He's wondering what's going on. Well, have a nice day. I'll see you later, Fia. Finn, are you there? All right. Have a nice day. I got to run, literally.